All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Frontiers on the Environment this week. A couple of things that I want to note. If you're using Twitter, please use the hashtag Frontiers. And also afterwards, when we do Q&A, please wait for me to come around with the microphone so that our online audience can hear you as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Louis Gilbert, who is our Managing Director here at the Institute on the Environment. And his big question today is the current university funding model sustainable? Take it away.
All right. Thank you, everybody. It's a topic that apparently people are interested in. John Foley summed it up in a tweet this morning that the short answer is probably no. But I told him I was going to use a few more words and try and bring us to a more positive conclusion. So first, a couple of caveats that I'm really going to focus only on the research side of the university. There are very complicated questions that are related to the relationship between the educational and the research missions of a university, and in particular how tuition and the relationship between research funding and tuition. I'm not going to touch any of those. That's a whole nother sticky problem. In talking about research, I think it'll become clear later in the talk that I think that our historical triumvirate of teaching, research, and engagement is also outdated, and that essentially the engagement part should be embedded in the teaching and the research parts. So when I say research, I haven't forgotten about that part, particularly here at a land-grant university, but I have some specific thoughts about the relationship between the research and the engagement part. So we're going to start with a little history, and apologize, this is not the U. This is my former employer, and my window used to be that one. But it says Science Hall really big on it, and I kind of like that part. So a little history. Prior to the Second World War, the federal government had very little engagement in university research. And prior to that time, really the mission of universities focused pretty heavily on the educational part. And to the extent that faculty did research, it tended to be individual, and it tended to be self-funded or funded through philanthropy, and it wasn't the core mission of the university. Now, that's a sweeping statement, and clearly there are exceptions, particularly at a land-grant university. Land-grant universities have had something of a research mission in the sense that they were charged with helping farmers, manufacturers, and military folks do their things better. But a lot of that was applied research, although, again, you could argue how clear that distinction is. And of course, Wisconsin was a premier land-grant university, and you could argue that particularly at the leading land grants, that distinction between applied and basic wasn't as strong as it might be. And then along came the Second World War, and it was clear to many of the leading bureaucrats and scientists and others that worked at the interface between research and the government that the development of that science and the ability to bring science to bear on warfare could be a key element in the success or failure of efforts in the Second World War. And this slide just is to show some of the things that came out of the Second World War. This, I'm sure everybody recognizes this as the Norden bomb site, which was key to the more I've looked at this slide over the last few days, the more horrified I've become. Each of these, and this is Harry Hess, who spent the war mapping the ocean bottoms using newly developed sonar. His work led to seafloor spreading, which eventually led to plate tectonics. Up here are Robert Oppenheimer and Leslie Groves at the site of the Trinity test, and here is radar. At the key, and in each of these, with perhaps the exception of Hess, fundamental research was key to advancing these technologies. For instance, in order for radar advanced tremendously during the war, and due in large part to advancements in what would become solid-state electronics. The ability to make vacuum tubes of higher and higher power with more and more precision was central to the development of radar. And of course, atomic physics was central to the atomic bomb. Not here are the proximity fuse, cryptography, to name a couple. So throughout as the war progressed and as it became clear the U.S. would be drawn into the war, the United States spent more and more time thinking about the relationship between the military and basic research. And we created a thing called the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which reported directly to the president and oversaw the development of all of these, again, with the possible exception of Hess. And Hess is here because I was an oceanographer for a long time, and seafloor spreading was cool. But with the possible exception of Hess, all of these things were advanced under a single organization called the OSRD, which was headed up by a guy called Vannevar Bush. OSRD was incredibly technocratic. It really focused on technological and deep into the physical sciences. There were no natural sciences. There's certainly no social sciences. Again, it's another story I'm not going to tell. I'm not going to talk about the social sciences today, but it's an interesting story. So coming out of the Second World War, Roosevelt has passed away. Truman is now president, and Vannevar Bush, this fellow, pushed very hard to build on the success that scientific research had demonstrated during the Second World War. And he said that it's really important that the U.S. continue to do the kind of unfettered research that was possible during the war. And he essentially got Truman to ask him for this report, Science, the Endless Frontier. In the history of science, particularly, well, let's just say in the history of U.S. science in the 20th century, this is about as foundational a document as you'll find. And Bush put this document together, and it's essentially a social contract. It said that if the federal government gave money to scientists and left them alone, then scientists would provide a strong economy, a strong defense, a healthy population, and a well-educated workforce. It's not quite that clean, but that's the basic promise. And it reflected the state of things at the time pretty well. But I want to dissect that a little bit, because crucial, it really was a contract. You can really read it as a contract. It wasn't like two parties signed it and it's been adjudicated. But it does say very clearly that scientists are the best people to judge the progress of science, and that the best scientists should be rewarded with funds to do their research. So the steering of our investment in science with the endless frontier, what I call the Bush model, what many people call the Bush model, clearly sets up the idea of peer review, of a meritocracy in the funding of science, and it sets apart science from other parts of society. It says scientists should be left alone to pursue the best work, and by serendipity, the best work will advance our society. There was a lot of politics, and part of the reason I'm hammering on that meritocracy was there was another model at that time that would have spread research dollars more evenly, sort of like the EPSCoR program tries to do now. That is, it would spread research dollars more evenly by geography rather than by meritocracy. But in the long haul, and after a lot of political, rather bruising fight, Bush won and the National Science Foundation was established. In that same time, the Office of Naval Research also established a funding program that was focused primarily on the oceans. And this had to do with submarines and submarine warfare and understanding the thermal and sound structures of the ocean. But again, the premise in the ONR was that I have a degree from Columbia. I studied at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. By the time I got there, ONR had more or less gone away, but there would still be stories of ONR folks coming around once a year, being around for a couple of days, having a couple of seminars, and then metaphorically at least leaving a big check behind and saying, we'll see you next year. So ONR was big on block funding. It was very much, my impressions having been at Lamont are that it was very much a clubby kind of thing. Right, so that model, with the establishment of ONR and NSF, US university research took off. I was going to try and make a joke about this being a picture of Tate Lab taken a few days ago, but it is a picture of Tate Lab, and it was taken in 1951, and it's in here to stimulate thinking about the rapid expansion of facilities, the rapid, as universities recognized that there was going to be a new way of paying for research and doing research, and universities rapidly expanded their ability to do particularly physical science research. Now, the federal government didn't pay for a lot of the facilities, but they did pay for the equipment and the work and all of that would go on inside of facilities. And so universities began expanding and rapidly. And as that went on, it became clear that there were going to be additional costs associated with doing research in universities. And so at the same time as we, the US, were saying, well, the federal government should fund basic research, we also recognized that in those funding models, there was going to have to be some, in addition to the direct costs of, what I'm getting at is this is where indirect cost recovery comes from. In addition to the direct costs of salaries and buying equipment, there were going to be costs having to do with expanding libraries, expanding buildings and their footprint, employing personnel to do the bookkeeping and that sort of thing. And so as this model unfolds, indirect cost recovery becomes an integral part of it. And prestige began to be associated with your ability to do research. And prestige has historically been measured in terms of research activity, how much research do you do, and we measure that by how much money we spend on research. Or here, Brian Herman's office tends to report rather the value of grants that we've won. And we can, well, those of us who care about such things can argue which is the better model or the better measure, but the long and short of it is that prestige has been linked with how much research you do, not so much what the research is, but how much. And so with this rapid growth of federal funding of research, we started to lock in some things. One of them is the expectation that funding would grow. Another is that there would be full indirect cost recovery, as we refer to it now, and rates here, it's embarrassing, I don't know exactly the rate, but it's in the neighborhood of 55%. I have been places where the indirect cost recovery rate was close to 80%. I haven't been anywhere it's higher than 80%, but I've been places where it was close. And so those two things have sort of become established in our thinking about the research culture at particularly large research universities. And this just shows the history of federal research funding by performer, and universities are this bit in the gray. And the chunk of time I've been talking about is essentially up through about here. So there's a period of very rapid growth in which universities build out very quickly and lock in long-term commitments. Operating a laboratory isn't something you can just turn off. There will be thousands of feet of space that have to be lit, heated, cooled, cleaned, and hopefully there's some equipment or people in there also. And I couldn't quite figure out how to do this, so this is what I got. But this upper graph, which is much smaller, the point of this graph, there are 2 points, one of which you can see, which is that there's and this one is by discipline. This graph shows research expenditure by discipline since about 1970. There's one that just completely dominates everything else, and that's NIH biomedical research. So a big chunk of this growth here is biomedical. And the other thing that you can see sort of qualitatively is that all other fields have grown either very slowly or not at all since the 1970s. And in the fields that are probably represented in this room, environment has actually declined. The physical sciences and, this is non-biomedical life sciences. So, well, non-biomedical life sciences have actually declined. This is engineering, so engineering has continued to do fairly well. If you look in detail, at a different slice at this, you can see that there's a lot of nuance when we report numbers about research spending. And one of the ones that I think I've kept out of this is the difference between basic, applied, and developmental research. And I think I come back to that later in the slide. Oh, here I put the slide in so that you can see it. So we launched this thing in the 50s. It goes like gangbusters for a couple of decades. Definitely into the 70s, things are still going gangbusters. Along about the time when Ronald Reagan is elected president, things start to change. At the very least, the rhetoric starts to change around scientific research. Let's see. So this is how I think about it. Prior to the 80s, coming out of the Second World War through the 60s and 70s, there were more ideas there were a lot more dollars than there were ideas. So when you're in that state, that is, you have lots of money and you have plenty of money to go around, it's not really necessary to prioritize what your scientists work on. And in that state, Bush's contract works great because scientists will bring scientific judgment to bear on what's good science. Peer review will, for today I'm going to say, In that period, in that state, peer review works fairly well. We can talk about the conservative nature of peer review later. And so in that state, the Bush model works great. This graph down here shows the growth, and this was actually hard data to find. This is the worldwide PhDs granted annually, and the interesting line, because I'm only talking about US research universities, is this blue line, which is the US. And you can see again that if we think of that blue line, or the number of PhDs produced annually, as some proxy for the amount of ideas that are available, you can see that ideas grow very rapidly up through the late 60s, and then grow much more slowly after that. So my argument is that sometime in the, I say 1980s, but sometime between the very latest 1970s and certainly by the 1990s, the number of people active, the number of ideas available to pursue outstrips the amount of money available to pursue those ideas. That's a key element in my thinking. And when that happens, I argue it's no longer that prioritization of the ideas we pursue becomes much more important, because we have limited resources. We have to decide how to use those resources. And that's a key element to my thinking. I thought I was actually going to put together a talk where I didn't show Pasteur's quadrant, but I failed. This is another way of thinking about what I've been talking about. On this axis is the quest for fundamental understanding. How does the mantle and the outer core, how does the interface between the mantle and the outer core work? How does sound propagate through the inner core and the outer core? How does quantum mechanics work? How do we, and in this case, how do we think about the structure of a molecule? These are all things that are driven entirely by the curiosity of scientists, and that curiosity is directed toward understanding the world from an individual perspective. It's how does an individual or how does a small group of people think about how the world works. The other blue, so that's this axis. On this axis is consideration of use. Am I trying to do something? Am I trying to accomplish something? So in this one, we've got Edison trying to make a light bulb. Edison didn't care about, all he wanted was something that glowed when you put a current through it. He didn't care why it glowed. He just wanted something. So he just tried, 999,000 things he knew that didn't work until he found carbon thread, I think, cotton thread. So Edison, all he cared about was use. But then there are a class of problems that require both advances in our fundamental understanding and are driven by a desire to change things outside of the laboratory. And that's Pasteur. Pasteur was concerned with improving public health, and in order to do that, he had to figure out basically microbes and germ model of disease transmission. So Pasteur didn't set out, Pasteur wasn't driven by a curiosity about things he couldn't see that made you sick. Pasteur was driven by the desire to reduce the number of people who were sick around him. And in order to do that, he had to understand he had to develop a theory that underlay what we've come now to understand as hygiene. So my argument is that we have moved into a realm where we need to prioritize how we spend our research dollars. And I assert that this is a good way to do it. That is, we should think about what is it that we're trying to accomplish outside of the academy. We is not just the university, but it's we, a broader society, because the money is coming from, I mean, if we're just talking about federal funding of universities, the money is coming from taxpayers, and in democracy there's some sense that we should all have some input on that. So this prioritization that I'm arguing needs to occur needs to reflect objectives outside of the academy. That calls for the development of new partnerships, and I argue that we should be putting much more emphasis on problems that are in what's called Pasteur's quadrant. So, and it also calls for new measures of prestige. If it's actually really easy to spend a lot of money here, and we have spent a lot of money here. It's actually harder to spend money here because the problems are harder to figure out what they are. So I'm arguing, so another sort of take home, for those of you playing along, keeping score at home, I'm arguing that we need another measure of prestige that has to do with impact beyond the academy. How much is what we're working on? How much are the fundamental discoveries that we're making enabling things to happen beyond the academy? So that's the articulate and prioritize out of one of the tweets recently. So another thing that in order to accomplish this, we need to create new models of how we think about the development of research ideas. This is just a sketch. There's two things here. One, I actually think that this is a way to do it, but the other is the idea that we need to be like writing on the back of napkins and really be thinking outside the box in how we relate the research we do outside the academy. But basically the idea here is that there are ideas outside of the academy that require teams, and it's separating. I'm not happy with separating anything these days, but it's saying that the university has a boundary. And the university does some things really, really well. And in here I've called them knowledge production and assembly and producing output like maps and that sort of thing. But the real point here is that we need new institutional ways of thinking about how we go about research. And there's a whole literature in the I don't know, it's a whole about boundary organizations, and this is really a symbol for a boundary organization. An organization whose objective is to span the boundary between two separated things, and in this case, it's the university and things outside of the university. And I&E, the reason I came to I&E is that I&E has really incorporated some of this thinking into its culture. And for instance, this is a map. It's a map of yield attainment. It's information that can help us think about where hunger might exist and where we might improve our ability to grow crops. But more importantly, this is a symbol of an interaction between scientists who are good at managing very complex data sets, who are good at developing statistical tools, and who, well, those two things in particular here. And this map is a result of ongoing conversations between scientists here at the Institute on the Environment and managers and strategists at private sector firms such as Cargill, Land O'Lakes, General Mills, Mosaic, and so on. So one of the things that I&E has done is thought about how do we have these interactions between academic scientists who are interested in advancing fundamental understanding, and decision makers who are trying to decide how to invest in probably large-scale agriculture in other parts of the world. And we are learning. I won't say we know how to do it. We are learning how to do this. And I see Peter in the back there. I just want to extend kudos to Peter. I got this map in like less than 5 minutes and said, you know, do you want another one? And that's this. Part of that is that we have developed the capacity in these conversations. We've recognized the importance of being able to produce these maps, not just the maps themselves, but the ability to produce them. So we've created an infrastructure where this information is easily available. And some of it's available and the data is available on the web, and Peter answers his email quite promptly, at least when I write to him. Now, a more concrete, back to Wisconsin. I did spend some time at Wisconsin. So this is kind of the institutional personal relationship element of this infrastructural, this institutional thing that I think we need to work on. At Wisconsin, while I was there, I was part of the design team that designed the building that houses the Wisconsin Institutes of Discovery. And there are two interfaces at WID. One of them is this ground floor where the objective is to bring the public through a scientific building and to sort of buffer, well, not to buffer, to reduce the barriers, to lower well, let's see, increase, there's got to be a word for permeability. Increase the permeability between science and the public. So that's the there's a D in there, the bit that we're interested in gets swamped. And that's, let's see, hang on a second. And that's an important point, but what I want to call attention to here is that the red has been getting bigger consistently, as has the gray. So this is like total dollars, and then this is proportion, and this one is actually, it's really clear here that in terms of national research and development, the proportion done by the government has been going down, while the proportion being done by industry has gone up, and by other has also been going up. So again, if you're really being sort of strategic about where are the big piles of money, in this case, the industry is going to be part of that. Now, one of the things that another sort of subplot that has occurred over this time between the 70s and now is that the big industrial research labs have gone away. Bell Labs has gone away. IBM has, for all intents and purposes, gone away. Watson's gone away. So places that used to do pretty fundamental research, I mean, fractals came out of Bell Labs. Semiconductors came out of Bell Labs. That's gone away and it hasn't been replaced. One of the questions I have in my mind, and that was a really important part of our economic driving research and development infrastructure. Is there a way that universities can start to partner with places like Google, Tesla, Amazon, I guess to a certain extent, and rebuild that industrial research capacity only in a more dynamic way? We're not going to get Bell Labs back because it's hugely expensive to build something like that. But can we do that? Can we figure out a way to do that in a more dynamic way inside universities? Now, part of there's two parts to that. One is that I think I worry that part has gone away. The other is that the decline in federal funding is going to put a real squeeze on our ability to pay for our facilities. And at the center of a lot of what I'm concerned about in this sustainability is how do we replace research resources that paid 50% indirect cost recovery with even the same amount of research resources, but with 15, 10, 20% indirect cost recovery. So one of the things, one possible idea that I'm toying around with in my mind is a model where universities and industry partner on the fundamental end of the research activity, and we create more dynamic, we try to recreate some of the dynamism that was going on at Bell Labs and Watson and others in the well, really the 40s through the 70s. And then finally, I showed this slide. This is university R&D funding by source, and it shows this thing that I've been saying about the federal government. There's a slight increase, and you see the biomedical stuff, and so the federal government clearly dominates. But universities, actually, we self-fund. Of the funding that we spend on research, the second largest funder of that is universities ourselves. And part of that is reinvesting in direct cost recovery stuff. Some of that is venture funds like the MinDrive and that sort of thing. In some places, intellectual property goes into that. So the argument here is that we're not at the mercy, entirely at the mercy of external forces. Any reorganization like what I think we're poised upon is going to be painful. But we're not without our own resources. And universities, this university and others, I believe universities that think hard about how to use their resources, how to diversify their portfolios, and how to develop new models of thinking about the articulation and execution of research are going to be the universities that lead the way in terms of prestige in the 21st century, something grand and glorious like that. So that's my story. I'm sticking with it at least for the next 30 seconds. We'd love to hear what you think.
Thank you, Louis. All right, I'm opening up for questions.
Thanks, Louis. That was great. So you're talking about moving from a model where sort of there's a democratic process for assigning how much money gets spent on science and then scientists deciding where to spend it,
Right.
to something else where maybe industry or other sort of non-democratic entities are requesting certain types of research. I mean, what do you say to people like me who get really uncomfortable hearing that?
So I say, let's see, what do I say? I say two things. One, you haven't quite understood part of, I'm going to address the democratic part because I'm trying to argue that we need a stronger democratic input on at least the federal dollars that are getting spent. I believe that the questions here can't be articulated only by scientists. I'm arguing that we have to throw away that leave us alone part that was part of the Bush contract and say we can't be left alone any further. So that's one part. The other part is there we go. The other part is that if we're taking money from industry, there's going to be more of that drive. And here, the distinction between public and private universities will become really important. And April, I don't know whether April and I have been thinking about that a lot lately, because some of the things that you can do in private universities you can't do in public ones, having to do with how you use your resources. So that is a slippery slope, and I would say that it may be part of the price we pay for how things have unfolded.
Other questions? Does anyone else? Yep.
Jennifer Schmidt online would like to know, what do your conclusions mean for students who are in grad school and early career researchers? Will they need different skills and or training?
Yeah, yes. Yes, yeah, it's kind of like John Foley's version of my talk. Absolutely. The kinds of people who will work in situations like this will have very different skills. The arrows in here, part of it is the open arrows are process, and the dashy line solid head ones are knowledge feedbacks. One time I looked at this and I thought, oh gosh, everything feeds back to everything. It's not quite true, but it's almost true. And so graduate students going forward are going to need to be able to work much more in dynamic situations. They're going to need to be, I mean, if we're creating new models, and they're going to need to be entrepreneurial in the way that graduate students haven't historically been taught, trained. And that's another thing that we're working on here at the Institute, is how do we take the suite of leadership curricula and pedagogy that we've been developing and integrate them more in not only into the things that we do in the Institute, but into the university as a whole. Because graduate students I would argue now, but certainly in 5 or 10 years are going to need different set. And Fred will say things much more clearly than.
Actually, my question is about something else.
Okay.
So you gave an example of working with industry, and I guess I'll give a counter example that's kind of frightening to a university, and that's the Uber thing with Carnegie Mellon. So Uber, wants to do autonomous cars because they want to take over the world, and
Right.
and they are so Carnegie Mellon had a great center in that. So Uber, instead of working with them, says, oh, we get all this money from all these investors, we're just going to hire you. And they hired like 25 people and completely gutted this center at Carnegie Mellon. So
yeah.
that's,
So
how do we prevent that from happening? From Google coming in or a drug company coming in and saying, you know, we'll pay you professors, you know, 50% more money, and you know, you don't have to put up with tenure and all this other stuff. How does you know, how do you think that's going to play out?
I haven't. That gets to Eric. That's like the dystopian version of Eric's. I don't have an answer. In some sense, that's Uber saying, well, we're going to start to recreate the private sector industrial research labs. Right, right. And so I have not thought about that example. And so I'm going to punt and just say that's a design consideration that we need to think about in how we do things that symbolizes. Yeah.
So I guess it's sort of along this similar lines to what he was talking about. My question is about how do we deal with people who do research in fields that maybe aren't necessarily priorities
Right.
for industry funders, right?
Right,
Things like
right,
ecology and
right.
that sort of thing.
So one of the things that we're circling around is that there is a sense that makes me very nervous of the university starting to be really market driven. And I've certainly sketched out, it's easy to interpret what I've sketched out as a market driving thing. But I'd come back to this. The thing that separates universities from, even from Bell Labs, is that it's the quest for fundamental understanding. Bell Labs, in some sense, was actually in the use inspired because they didn't set out to discover semiconductors. They noticed that sometimes impurities in their semiconductors actually made them work better. The thing that will be crucial for universities is to maintain that long-term look and essentially be the refugia for where we think about the core mantle boundary. And we think about, I mean, in my own experience, seismologists who thought about the core mantle boundary freaked when we changed the name of Lamont and we started building the Earth Institute, because they saw it as a threat to what they were doing. And our response was, no, it's not a threat, but we may not do as much of it going forward. And that's simply a resource. Now, I don't think ecology falls in that. I mean, deep mantle seismology, I do actually think, because it falls in that. But universities will have to really stake out how we think about what we do compared to what's out in the world. And one of the reasons I have gone down the path I went down is I was in the seismology community in the late 80s and early 90s, and these guys couldn't figure out how to explain the relevance of what they were doing. You know, and it seemed to me that if buildings are going to fall on your head, that's relevant. So part of what we had to figure out was how that fit into a broader public policy frame. And it's the response, universities, this is something that universities are going to have to work very hard at, because it is what makes us different than other knowledge-producing organizations out there. And I believe it's incredibly valuable to society and that sort of thing. But it's going to get our discipline and our attention to that relationship is going to have to become stronger.
I've seen on your chart that you said that environment and another discipline study had dropped, and I was wondering, as far as that environment goes with the sciences and the way that the world is going, how are you going to prioritize which category of discipline of study that funds would be allocated to?
Right, and that's where the first question's point about democratization becomes really, really important, because I can see how I shaded that. What I'm arguing is that in this kind of place, the questions do have to be much more democratically. That is, they have to reflect the needs and desires of the society more broadly than they do now. And I would argue that ecology falls in that realm. But we have to avoid this sort of Aristotelian democracy, where what Aristotle worried about in democracy is that if everybody votes, you get leaders who are ignorant.
So maybe this is also a twist on Eric's question, and I think addresses this point. I mean, so the federal agency that I'm most familiar with is the National Science Foundation. And so it's not like the National Science Foundation is necessarily setting its priorities in a vacuum. I mean, it's setting its priorities because it has to go to Congress and justify. And so in that way, sort of, there is a democratization in that, the Congress is paying attention to its constituency and thinking about tax dollars. And I'm not saying that I necessarily always agree, with the outcomes, but
Right.
I mean, there is a process there where there's a check on NSF by Congress,
Right.
which is supposed to represent the needs of society at large. And I think the thing that scares, that prompted Eric's question is that there are a lot of parts of society that, have needs that aren't industrial, that aren't
Yeah.
represented by industry. And so who is going to represent sort of, the common person and those needs? And theoretically, the fact that NSF is getting money from Congress, which is, elected, should provide some of that feedback. It should.
It should.
And so, and so if it's not, then why not? And can you envision another way, sort of another kind of boundary organization that would, be able to provide that sort of input or feedback to NSF so that, it is reflecting sort of a broader suite of needs, a broader constituency, reflecting what society needs, and especially the voices in society that don't necessarily have,
Right.
resources to make their voices heard, I guess.
So I didn't talk about philanthropy at all, and another trend that I see is that there are now large philanthropies out there, blah, blah, blah. No, what I see is that this democratization really needs to be driven by scientists themselves, seeking out partners. So I'm not seeing this to me, NSF is a top-down push. And the competition for NS dollars is so strict and elite that it's going to be difficult to do the kind of I don't see the federal, particularly NSF, or being able to move rapidly enough and to be risk tolerant enough to take on the kind of problem articulation processes that I'm imagining. I know I haven't spent enough time talking about the amount of work that GLI has done to build the partnerships and conversations that they've had. Now, those have been, albeit with large private sector firms that have resources to do that sort of thing, to invest in the kinds of the problems of ecology and others. This is Lewis speaking as Lewis. I don't have confidence in the big agencies that they can take the risks that are necessary to really break out of, to really get to problems in Pasteur's quadrant. I think there's so much upfront work that has to be done to articulate problems here that I don't see the NSF being able to support that.
So we've talked a fair bit about the worries of democratizing these processes and democracy on top of science funding models. I'm really curious if you'd talk a little about the elitism of higher education in terms of a lot of the incentives are, the NSF or
Right.
certain journals or certain universities whose graduates populate faculties of those and many, many other universities, and how you see that incentive structure mapping on top of the what you've articulated as the requirements of these potential new funding models,
Right.
and frankly needs of society,
Right.
and how those two fit together.
Let's see. That gets, in some ways, that gets a lot into that bit that I said I didn't want to get, which is the relationship between the tuition, the sort of overarching university financial model, where the relationship between tuition and research is complicated. But that said, part of what I think we need to shift is our ideas around prestige, we need to, in my utopian world, scientists and teams of scientists who removed knowledge barriers, say, that help us understand why inequality in educational achievement it seems to be systemic. Help us that uncover fundamental understanding for things that have seemed intractable for decades. Well, I mean, they will be. Yeah, that would be good. People would be recognized for that. But there's I don't have a good answer. I'm just fumbling. But at the core of it is more of an emphasis on the outcome that is achieved than the intellectual feat that makes it possible. Anyway, we tend to focus on the intellectual feat rather than the outcome. And I'm arguing that we should shift our attention to the actual impact of what we do rather than the thing we did.
Alrighty, with that, we are just about at time. So, actually, we are at time. That clock's a little off. So, thank you, Lewis, so much for presenting this week at Frontiers. You're welcome to stick around. We do have food in the back, so feel free to ask more questions and have that conversation. Next week, April 13th, we're going to have Nick Jordan here, who is an Institute on the Environment Fellow, as well as a professor in CFANS. His big question will be, can new GMO crops help grow sustainable agriculture? So thanks again for joining us, and thank you, Lewis.